Gov, is everyone here?
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are. All right, cool. Thank you very much. I'm just going to assume that everyone is here. Debating on the motion, this House supports religious revival in the West, e.g., young people returning to Christianity, politicians expressing their religious identity. I would like to invite the Prime Minister here.
POI is just unmute. I am what God made me. In a time of uncertainty, all we have is doubt. It is religion that uniquely embraces doubt, that tells you that no matter what happens, it will be okay and you have something to live for. That at the end of the road, there are shiny, pearly gates that will welcome you with open arms. That is what people need in the world that is crumbling. That to be told that you are what God made you, and that is beautiful. Three key points of framing. First, on the revival and how this is a spectrum. I want to note that while a portion that they may argue is a return to traditional values, the rise in the revival is also a rise in alternative forms of religion. Like, for example, it looks like Muslim figures like New York City Mayor Mamdani having a celebration for Eid and Ramadan. It also looks like the reinterpretation of Catholic values with the introduction of new female bishops, as well as Pope Leo, for example, speaking out against AI and modernizing the church. So, what this means is that the rise is a literal increase. It has increased generally, but that means that there is an increase of all of these different forms of religion, particularly those of liberal ones. What that means is that even in the worst instances, there is a countervailing narrative or counteracting narrative that will hold the more radical forms accountable. So I want to note then, because not all parts of all religion can realistically be conservative, politicians will have to cater to a certain majority or minority. But note then that because of that, that means that there are going to be different ideas and different ideologies within these religions. The second is the idea of the shift and how the shift is a modernization of religion. So I want to note that this religious revival has historically been documented to be with the young people. We have seen like a 20% about then increase of individuals identifying with religion. So what this means is that because of the liberal ideas that like these individuals have been born into with the Me Too movement, for example, or the valuing of mental health and the idea of therapy, this means that these are more modernized ideas of Catholicism and reinterpretations of the different things, like for example, Catholicism and the reinterpretation of the Bible, or how imams in Islam have become increasingly more accepting of different individuals who are of LGBTQ nature, by for example. What this means is that these individuals are seeking active refuge, and oftentimes religion is a refuge because it reflects your own inner desires and your interests, as well as your ideologies, which means to explain why it is modernized. Note that this is increasingly liberal because these are in Western democracies. So, in fact, this religion is important is oftentimes going to be more based on morality and these individuals and what they believe in. For example, with Pope Leo and and secondly, on like the Muslim events and the accepting of other religions. The last thing that we're going to explain is why individuals have why the reason why this religious revival exists. Number one, again, there is a natural incentive to opt into religion, especially during times of doubt. But secondly, it's oftentimes because they are untouched by politics influence. That's not to say that they are not engaged with politics, but it means that the Pope, for example, is protected from whatever Trump says against them by the Vatican. It also means that they are then immune to the political pendulum and how it swings, and they keep their ideologies, even if they evolve over time. They're unlikely to be swayed by different like things that exist. I'll take that later. The third thing is that their incentive, they have an incentive to be palatable. The median is not MAGA. It's like, for example, the new increasing churches in Boston that are more accepting to LGBTQ individuals. But lastly, because this is a Western democracy, that means there are going to be things like separation of church and state that are important within these laws and have actively been shown throughout these different things, unlike, in example, undeveloped democracies. And what this liberalization means is that we see a rise in previously unpopular forms of religion like Buddhism and Islam. That explains that the religious rival is not extreme, and you can already wash out the material that will come from opposition about any conservatism. Note that the median case is often individuals who are embracing new forms of religion or updated forms. I'll take the POI.
Do you truly believe there's such a separation of church and state like you say it is? Because look at America. That is a Western liberal democracy. France is a Western liberal democracy. Yet they still banned hijabs and they still acted against the people's interest.
Yeah, so these are Western liberal democracies. They have engaged in the separation of church and state. But also, if there is already a lot of conservatism, that means that these are the individuals who are most important to facilitate the religious revival because they're the ones who can implement these policies. So even if it is conservative now, there are ways that we can fix that. The first thing I'm going to explain is solace and why people understanding where they're coming from is important. I want to preface the living conditions that people live in today. For example, the middle class is no longer the middle class that even with a singular health bill, they are suddenly thrown into the throes of poverty. People's needs are not being met. They cannot even have access to good drinking water because of AI data centers. So what this means is that the nuclear family or the template for what we thought is the way to live our lives is becoming increasingly untrue or hard to achieve. What this means is people feel lost, confused, and are unsure about their placement in society. Therefore, what religion uniquely does is firstly offer them alternative avenues as to what they're able to do because they're able to have a stability. Note that in current society there are too many avenues. They're told like for example, well if you do put all of your money in like crypto or something, you can be stable. If you put all your money in investments, or maybe if you start journaling, you can be stable. That variety and optionality is overwhelming. So what this means is that people will always return to what has always been there and that they feel comfortable within these already existing things and these systems. The second thing is that there is a natural tendency to default to traditional culture. Life is meaningless and hard. It is oftentimes hard to live with the reality that we are facing. That's why we oftentimes default to culture, which is because of the fact the comfort that it provides. But the alternatives that they could opt into, absent religion, which is constantly changing and evolving to adapt to liberalism, is bad because that's why the misogynist like alt-right is one of the worst alternatives that people have fallen into. It's better if they fall into Catholic alternatives, like because for example, these things can be developed by different other perspectives. But the misogynistic alt-right is a pipeline that is hard to get out of. The alternatives on their side of the house that people opt into when they feel unsure are much worse. The last thing is that these are a net positive. So they offer things like a community, a belief, and escape, and understanding what you are and your position in life. This is the value pack of like how to get better for the average person, and it will never run out. There are always ways you can reinterpret the Bible or read the Quran again and find new meaning. What this the fourth thing is that oftentimes your stability in religion is infectious towards other aspects of your life. So because you feel hope, you feel less nihilistic, and you're able to engage positively with other individuals and other aspects of your life. So because, for example, like I feel much more secure in my job because I was able to pray, or I know what to do when I feel insecure, I can eat better, I can feel better about my life. So the way that we weigh this up is that even if there's a silent, there's a loud minority of individuals who may be radical, for the vast majority of people who are experiencing the religious revival, they are the median instance and require the solace the most, and they feel much better about their position in life and engage better with society because of it. The second thing that we're going to run is uniquely why the revival must be done in the West and why it must be done at all. So I want to note about the West influence. It is very obvious that the West has a large global influence, whether that is in economics, in trades, in social, whatever. But it means that there's a unique influence in terms of the different religious institutions that are there. So because, for example, the like Vatican is situated in Europe, it means that they have a unique influence over the Catholics worldwide, which is why billions of people were watching the conclave, for example. And with the introduction of the American Pope, that has meant that it's becoming more liberal and democratized. So what it means is it's spread in a way that is relaxed, that is specific towards developed countries that cannot happen in developing countries. Why? Because they are already closed off and often developed internally. That's why the Catholic Church in the Philippines or in other aspects of Japan or like different Asian countries, for example, tend to be more conservative because they are uniquely closed off culturally as well. The alternative, if it never happened on their side of the house, is that if religion is so sinister and so bad, because it is because of the conservative values mixed in, that never changes. It changes more so on the developed side, but even then, it trickles down towards developing countries, which is why we've seen advancements in the Soji bill in the Philippines, for example, because there's an understanding from the Vatican that these things ought to be accepted because of Pope Francis's encyclical, for example. But if it means a lot then and religious is valuable as they will concede, then that increases the need for this to happen because it is only on our side of the house with the revival that the power that is situated in religion does not fall into those who are likely to corrupt it and go against the word of morality that has been inscribed in its scriptures. Very proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to the Prime Minister for the amazing speech. Now I'd like to invite the leader of opposition to start off the sub-sentence for the side opposition. Thank you.
Okay, lovely debate. So, in terms of POIs, I'll be taking them loud. I'll probably be taking them in my, what, yeah, after my first argument. just give me a second. Yeah, okay. My speech can then start in three, two, one. Panel, when the little Muslim girl is forced to go to school, stand up every single morning, and forced to pray, when she's getting oppressed by her colleagues and by her schoolmates for wearing her hijab or having different practices simply because that is not what Christianity tells you to do, we believe that this is a harm that cannot be reverted. And at that point, we are so proud to oppose today if that means that the religious and non-religious minorities within the state can still have the right to live peacefully. I think I'll do three things in this speech. First, some points on setup, and second, a few response to the two arguments that you get from first, and lastly, two arguments. Firstly, on how this has done harm to religious and non-religious minorities, and secondly, on how this has led to the rise of state populism and why this is particularly harmful, especially in the West. But first, on setup, three things. One, what does the religious revival actually look like? I think three things on this then. Firstly, it has led to significantly more engagement with the majoritarian religion within the state. Why is this likely? Because mostly two things. One, a majority these states are already just pushing anyways. This is that look at the US, where Trump is mainly pushing Christian values, claiming that he came from a religious household and stuff like that, meaning that this religion is significantly more proximal to individuals. But I think secondly, and then for a majority and a long period of time, people have already been distant from these minority religions simply because of the narratives that have been spread to them. Look at in the US, things like 9/11 and the hate has had towards Muslims. We think that it's extremely unlikely that people can actually engage with these minority religions and this is something that have to engage with in second. But secondly, it has led to an increased rise of Sikh populism. Why? Because these politicians see this as a political group to be accessed and there's a new voter base that they can then try and appeal to within the state. But I think thirdly, it has already led to the reintegration of religious principles within society, and this means all religious principles. Because notice, I think they try and give you an argument on how the religion is likely to evolve when they're sent to the house, but note two things. One, a majority of these principles are deeply stemmed in their religion. That is then say that they're likely going to be taking conservative stances at the point that this both people already buy into in a specifically radical society. But I think secondly, there's already a class within politics on what these go against. That is then say that the religious and the Christian narratives towards the LGBTQ and towards things like Roe v. Wade are likely then going to be contended, and at that point it is directly necessary to appeal to your voter base to go by these standings. But secondly, what is the nature of status quo? We think two things. One, the society was already becoming more progressive, but now there's been a pushback to more conservative ideologies. But I think, secondly, other than the original confusion within the youth that they try to appeal to and explain why this is symmetric, but also there's a really a rise in the conflict within politics. But
PY?
lastly, what is our metric for opposition within this debate? We think this has done harm on four metrics. Firstly, on how this has already done harm within society. Secondly, how does then harm done to religious and non-religious minorities within these states. Thirdly, on how the quality of politics is already going to get worse. But lastly, how the quality of religion already deteriorates within the states. But first, on a bit of response. I think they give this whole argument on solace. And I think the premise of this then is that how people are going to feel less confused and are going to acquire significantly more of a sense of meaning on their side of the house. I think two
PY?
things on this. Firstly, note the impacts of a sense of meaning are completely unsymmetric, especially in the West, where we have strong capitalistic narratives. That is then say that people are already likely going to describe and ascribe other sense of meaning. This is probably going to look like me trying to become as rich as possible and me trying to find the value in these things, things the sides that are already prevalent and spread within these states. But second, why is this significantly better on our side? Because the narratives that we already have are significantly more inclusive. That is then to say that things like capitalism can then be engaged by all people within the state and within society. We think that on the comparative, you're going to be significantly excluding the people who don't agree and who cannot engage with the religious principles, and they're saying that in my argument. But second argument that they give you then is why it's necessary as a unique influence on developing states. And I think the whole premise of this then is that these
PY?
nations are then likely going to opt into significantly less progressive action. You're going to have significantly more progressive religious bases. I think notice this argument doesn't engage with how religion is actually engaged with within these developing states at all. That is then to say that inherently in their nature, they're already progressive. That is, they're not already conservative. What does this mean? That is extremely unlikely, even with the mass amounts of Western buy-in, that they're probably going to be opting into these practices at the point where this is something that you've been told for your whole life. For your whole life, you've been told that you have to become a housewife and you have to take care of your husband. For your whole life, you've been told that being LGBT is already a harmful thing within society. We think that it is extremely unlikely that the progressive nature that they try to opt in, corruption that's in the house is going to happen due to the nature of these states in and of themselves and the radical nature that religion has to take for buy-in. But first argument then on how this has already done harm to religious and non-religious minorities within the state. I think the premise of
You know
this is
why?
simple. Notice, these minorities are not only going to be forced to engage with the majoritarian religion and their expression, but rather they're going to get significantly more backlash from trying to live their lives due to the contention with religious principles. I think this is true for three reasons. Firstly, proselytization within the state is particularly harmful. That is then at the point where you have religious people knocking door to door, telling you buy into the religion, become saved. And notice how this happens significantly more due to the religious narratives about preaching and ensuring as many people as possible can opt into your religion. Notice how this already removes the safe spaces for these non-religious and religious minorities and already forcing them to engage with these religions against their own will and autonomy. But secondly, the revival is partly institutional. That is then say
You know
that
why?
schools making students say a Christian prayer in the morning without any form of exemption, regardless of your religion. Because notice how you're being forced to engage with the other religion, and even then you're getting pushback for engaging with your own principles as an individual. But I think thirdly, note the pushback on any action that is not against, not part or against the doctrine. That is then why you have significantly more complacency towards LGBTQ groups. This is why you have significantly more complacency in hatred towards Muslims in the status quo for wearing things like hijabs or trying to practice their own religious practices, panel. Because notice, this is completely different and this is contentious to the doctrine. And at that point, the radical stances that especially the narratives and institutions such as politics and schools are going to have to take is likely going to be contention with this. But note that this is harmful for two reasons. Firstly, the oppression of these minorities within the state at the point that already a disenfranchised actor is likely to get significantly worse in the comparative. But I think secondly, the tensions between these groups actually increases and note how this is likely going to lead to significantly more conflicts and even then how this is just going to do harm to these minorities at the point where they have no platform in their disenfranchised. But note why this argument is particularly important for two reasons. Firstly, in principle, that is then say
You know
that the
why?
state can no longer accommodate for all people within the states, how this goes against the state power principle and the very thing that Western-led democracy stand for. But secondly, note how this is blatantly discriminatory against these minorities, and at that point, we cannot stand for this. But second metric then, especially when it comes to vulnerability, let's then say that these actors and minorities are already disenfranchised. At the point where you're removing their
You know
platforms or
why?
removing
Last
their safe
chance.
spaces, this is already doing more harm. Before I go to my second argument, I'll take you.
Yeah, so conservative Christianity has always existed. The important difference is absent the revival, unpopular religions like Islam or the reinterpretation of the Bible that counteract it would not exist.
Okay, that doesn't make sense because the narratives and the conservative narratives that you claim to exist on your side don't exist to begin with because they're forced to engage with radical natures. Engage with that in your second speech. Second argument then on how this has led to the rise of state populism, especially from politicians. The premise of this then is that the religious uprising has then led to an increase in populism due to the new access to a voter base within the state and how this has done more harm to the quality of politics. I think this is true for four reasons. Firstly, mass amounts of people buy in or give politics with bad incentives, the ability to use religion to get into positions of power based on the identity political nature. But secondly, note, politicians become icons. Look at Donald Trump within the US becoming an icon for Christians in America. Meanwhile, he isn't even a Christian, but rather is using this as an exploitative mechanism to acquire voters. But thirdly, it's just the rhetoric that real Christians vote for Trump, and this is also used as a guilt trip that God sent me, that if you don't vote for me, you can go to hell. And at that point, it's going to lead to the exploitation of religious minorities, but on religious groups. But lastly, religion in politics is unique in its power. That is then say that as an institution, your family, your school, the church, you go on the weekends will all pressure you into what is right for the religion, being voting for this actor. But note, this is harmful on two metrics. Firstly, you get significantly worse politics due to a focus on identity politics. But secondly, this is then a justification for discriminatory policies within the state. Think of the pushback against Roe v. Wade within the US and how this led to the disenfranchisement of minorities. Panel, think of the minorities who are still going to be suffering under their side of the house due to this religious uprising on those grounds proposed.
All right, thank you very much to the Leader of Opposition for your lovely speech. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the substantive first side government review.
Uh,
Hi. Am I audible and visible? Oh,
Yes, you are.
okay. My first word. When you're lost in a foreign country that you have never been to, your first instinct is to look for the places you have been and you have seen to try to make your way back to where you want to be. This is the natural inclination of the human condition when they are lost. To search for anchors, to search for ways to feel assured once again. Because it is scary to not know what happens next. It is scary to see your brothers and your friends be deployed in a war you don't understand. It is scary to see the cost of food rise past what you have allotted your budget for. And life is terrifying, even for those in the West. We think that it's unfair for team opposition to not deal with the harms of not being able to access solace and just wash over the impact that Reggie so carefully builds. The first response I want to launch is to call out their sole example, which is on America. I want to note that this is a very convenient example for them to use because this is the only example where you can see all of the analysis happen. They don't talk about the other countries in the West, like in Europe or like in Scandinavia. They only talk about America, not even its neighbor up at north. What this means is that their example relies on a hedge case and they're arguing on a hedge case. But secondarily, they're all arguing on the singular precedent out of 250 years of American existence was broken norms-based international policies. The only precedent, the only individual, and the only form of governance that is able to exemplify their analysis. What this means is that their analysis cannot be believed. It is relying on an example that is quite convenient and is uncharitable. I think that this is an unfair burden to place on proposition to only engage in one arena. What Regina so carefully explains is that there are more than one Western countries that we have to deal with at the very end of the day. But note, for this example to matter in this debate, they had to explain two things. The first, the longevity of like these sorts of leaders and these sorts of populist rhetoric. But secondarily, why the impact is so superseding and it affects all Western developed countries. They don't explain any of these, but I will cut it off already at deputy. First, on longevity. Note, they cannot explain why this will extend into the future and why their impact will spread and spread towards other countries because people are becoming increasingly disillusioned by the strongman and populist religious rhetoric that they used. For instance, in Hungary, Peter Magyar literally lost, even though they were sponsored by the West, by American politicians using religious rhetoric and Catholic rhetoric. It is no longer working. In like foreign countries as well, like Italy, it is no longer working. Giorgia Meloni's popularity is crumbling, even though she uses a lot of the populist rhetoric that they exemplify. What this means is that the rise doesn't look like the populist strongman things that they suggest. It is actually the sort of rise that Regina carefully explains in her speech as well. But note, I want to note that the US and this example cannot contaminate other countries as well because they don't explain why they have the capacity to. What we explain, however, is that the other Western countries or most Western countries have the capacity to have a stronger capacity to supersede a lot of the horrible things that MAGA discusses because they have an interest to supersede these things as well. I want to note that there are more median instances in this debate, i.e., French women increasingly choosing to wear hijabs even though there is a ban on hijabs. This looks like Canadian Catholic outreaches growing in number and support. There are many other countries under this motion. It is unfair for them to debate on their example. But even if this example was important, note, we already take the trade-off very carefully at first because we explained that solace is significantly more important on net and on scale because everyone is lost in life. Everyone is affected, maybe in varying degrees, but it is still a certain and important harm. So even if it's not as extreme as what opposition might suggest, it is far more certain than what they explain. And note, even if some people become extremist or some people become horrible as they explain, note that oftentimes these people exist in the minority. They have no other analysis to explain why this is not the case. The second response I want to note is their claim that solace doesn't matter because the only response that they could give Regina meaningfully is to say that this is a wash because many people live in capitalistic systems. This is false. Economic systems have no impact onto the necessities of the human condition. Everyone, regardless of whether or not it is communist or libertarian, want to feel safe and assured. This is uniquely why religion is such an important benefit under this motion as well. But note, they have no mechanism as to why solace is significantly better on their side of the house. They have no alternatives. I would like to point you back to what Regina suggests are alternatives under this motion, wherein it is traditions, more conservative values, because again, people people want to feel anchored, we think that these alternatives are significantly more sinister because they do not progress over time, and traditions are traditions because they are withstanding and do not change. Which is why religion, even if it is imperfect, is the necessary counterbalance to the necessities that people feel at the end of the day. The last response I want to launch is their claim on why religion oppresses minorities and why this is bad. I want to note that this is a non-issue because the West is a liberal democracy, which means that the only way they can meaningfully force minorities into opting into religion is through things like their own examples, which is that they're forced to pray in schools or they are forced to maybe like have to pray in bathrooms. This isn't that big of an impact compared to what we explain, which is that individual people feel like the world is crumbling around them and they need something to hold on to. Because if you are forced to pray in school, a person can simply just choose not to recite the words. There isn't much of a penalty for that as well. But note, I want to note that it's on our side of the house that is actually
Point.
significantly more accommodating towards minority cultures and minority religions. Because now that people are becoming more religious, there is a consensus understanding that these things are actually important. That being able to pray to your God is important because it's important to me. Therefore, this is why there are more like Muslim accommodating schools that have prayer rooms. This is why, for example, people are becoming more accommodating towards different discussions of religion, and why the rise isn't just Catholicism anymore. It actually encompasses Islam, Buddhism, and many other religions of the world. The substantive I want to run here is quite simple. It's just a way up and a vertical to what Regina explains. It is why solace is the most important impact in this debate. Because opposition explains that on extent, wars, propaganda, and populists done by politicians like Trump is the absolute worst thing in this debate. I want to wash it out in two ways. The first is that politicians will constantly use what is popular to their advantage. This looks like Macron using Catholic rhetoric to defend austerity, but also banning hijabs moments later. This looks like Trump calling Muslims horrible things whenever it is convenient, but building alliances with individuals like Mamdani because it is strategic. What this is to illustrate is that politicians, whether or not it is religion that is popular, will always use what is like socially advantageous to them in order to advance their own beliefs. What this means is that if populism is dangerous, whether or not it is under the guise of religion, it will always exist. It is a non-issue and an impact that should not be based in this debate as well. But secondarily, I would like to note that very little people opt into populism and the extreme things they suggest simply because of religion. If it were true that all it takes is religious rhetoric to get people to buy into very extreme things, then at present, we should already be in holy wars. We should already be very, very accepting of female bishops. We should already be believing everything that Pope Leo says. But that is simply not the case because people are inherently rational creatures. There are very valid concerns behind opting into populism, which is why it is not a problem of the religious rise. It is a problem overall on society. For all such reasons, propose. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much to the Deputy Prime Minister for the lovely speech. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the substantive for said opposition. Thank you.
Hello, just confirming that I'm audible and visible.
Yep, you are.
POI preference is loud. I have a cold, so I'm sorry if my voice sounds a tad odd. And yeah, let me just turn on my timer. Okay, I pronounce she, her. My time begins in 3, 2, 1. According to religious books, God is all powerful, all knowing, and all good. But thankfully and fortunately, Western states are not. Notice, panel, we think traditions are withstanding and do not change. This is to say that when religious books say things like God is the same forever, it is very unlikely that religious communities will literally buy out of this as a whole. Notice then on what they said and our responses. Firstly, I think many of the premises rely on the fact that the reinterpretation of the Bible must occur frequently. If I can prove to you why we think the reinterpretation of the Bible is unlikely to occur, I think we're able to take out most of the premises. Notice, firstly, We do not think the reinterpretation of the Bible will occur because these beliefs are unlikely to be liberalized to a certain extent. Because notice, you still have the old Caucasian church elders who have the louder voice. You still have the religious book telling them that it's good to be patriarchal. This looks like the Bible saying that women shouldn't preach. This looks like premises like men being the dominant power and the leader of households literally being stated within churches. It looks like quite literally questioning your leaders, and as a result, literal verses about talking and listening, and not like questioning your leaders, quite literally coming up because these leaders are so angry and so offensive. We think what's even more likely to happen on this whole chart of more liberal beliefs is that firstly, we think when religion is diluted, you kind of have a sect of the religious body that feels alienated, right? The people who felt as though they were true devotees. I think what's likely to happen on the opposition side of the house is that you'll probably lead to more extremism. You'll have these people who are previously devoted now being like, well, we do not align with this religion anymore. We think that is uniquely wrong. I'll tackle that a bit more in my argumentation. And then again, panel, I think a large premise of theirs too is a whole chart on hope and solace. They tell you that the reason they think hope and solace is so important within the current global climate is because you have middle-class individuals being thrown into poverty. But notice, we think a unique response to this is because of the amount of people being thrown into poverty. What tends to happen is threefold. Firstly, you have the propagation of prosperity gospel from mega churches. I'll deal with that a bit more later. And secondly, I think even when they're chatting about like even in the worst instance, there's a counteracting narrative that will hold the most accountable. We think that's unlikely to happen because notice, we think we still have a significant amount of hope and solace on our side of the house. You still have people who are trying to rely on their family members who still have tangible efforts. Panel, we think it's extremely uncharitable for them to literally come up here and say the only way you can have hope is by ascribing to a specific religion. And notice then, panel, we think going back to a religion that quite literally oppressed you as a woman, as an LGBTQIA individual, is uniquely harmful to your identity. Two arguments then. Firstly, on why we think the religious revival in the West has significantly weakened political steam and led to less social movements. And secondly, on why we think the religious revival in the West has significantly diluted the sanctity of religion. So even though the third speaker might come up here and start trying to claim hope again, we've already come at this at the nip. Notice then, how? We think political steam, like social movements, literally rely on liberal leftist ideas. This looks like feminist ideas. This looks like gay rights. We think this is uniquely important. That is to say, we think when the youth turn to religion, they choose one of two things. Firstly, they choose not to engage with politics as frequently. As I mentioned earlier, you have your church elders telling you that Trump is the ascribed person that you should be following. We think this not only happens in Western states like the United States of America, but we think this also happens consistently within European countries. And secondly, we think it also happens when individuals are told to be rightist because Trump is seen as God's chosen one, simply because he claims to be Christian. This directly engages with Joshua's chat on populism, which they literally chose not to engage with whatsoever. Notice then, we think because people are going back to religion, you're told to cast your burden onto the Lord. This then looks like people being like, oh, why should I care about this politician so much? God will deal with them. Notice what we think the unique importance of the youth within social movements is. Firstly, we think they can mobilize more. They can spread their voices more. They can quite literally go out to protest for days on end. They're not going to get some backaches. Secondly, we think what's also really important, why it's really important for the youth to engage in social movements is because they're able to have far more lobbying power when it comes to things like raising their voice, when it comes to things like posting more consistently on social media, understanding how the algorithm works in order to lobby for change. And notice then, we think this revival amidst this political climate in the West, which we told you is currently enduring a lot of populist ideas, is uniquely wrong, because this then means that social movements not only use the youth, but politicians quite literally justify sexist policies with biblical values, and the older people within the church who are quite literally within the church and within these religious institutions who are quite literally dictating the type of sermons you hear on Sunday are then able to dictate the type of narratives that are thrown to you as a youth. We think this looks like the idea of the one household, one vote policy that was literally being propagated by a Republican during an interview on Good Morning America, where they were quite literally advocating for the men of the household to be voting. We think it's uniquely wrong. Second argument then on why we think the religious revival in the West has significant significantly diluted the sanctity of religion. Yes, I'll take that.
Yeah, so there's no denial on our side that Trump has not done any of these things. But why wouldn't feminists engage with liberal forms of religion? And isn't it true that women in France, for example, have become more comfortable and willing to wear hijabs in public? You cannot just have your example, you must engage with ours.
I think we have engaged with yours at the point in which we tell you when a feminist decides they're going to go back to their religion, then that is uniquely wrong to their feminist identity or to their LGBTQIA identity. Because what they're directly told is that they have to stifle a certain part of of their identity in order to be in alignment with the values of the religious institution they're buying into. Notice and panel on why we think religion should remain sanctified and why we think religious revival, specifically in the West, has diluted this. We think it's uniquely bad because you have capitalists literally propagating things like prosperity gospel. Notice how this uniquely comes at their own argument on the whole chart that, well, people, specifically minorities, will be able to find hope. Notice then you have capitalist preachers like Stephen Furtick literally telling the congregation that they need to donate a certain amount to the church in order to ensure that they reap the same amount, and often that doesn't happen. And when it doesn't, you as a minority are told it's okay, it'll happen next month, just wait on the Lord. We think that is uniquely wrong because then the quite literal beliefs and pains of these individuals are undermined. And secondly, we think because the West is largely capitalist, this tends to quite literally dilute the beliefs like consistently, right? We think this looks like giving more like palpable preachings. This then means that you alienate the older demographic, like above the age of 40, etc., who were like previously believing on a more like spiritual experience of religion. We think this is unique to the West because firstly, not only does the West have populist ideas, but secondly, we think its political climate makes it that individuals are highly polarized. That is to say, we think when you have religion in the mix of politics, things become even crazier. And we think the importance of sanctity is this. We think the importance of sanctity within religion is the ability to continue to propagate these historical narratives that you felt aligned with your identity. If you have another identity that you do not believe aligns with your religion, we don't think you should be forced to suppress it. We think that's what proposition tells you. And then again, panel, I think we already win this debate at the point in which we can prove we've already proven two things. Firstly, that we've told you that the reinterpretation of the Bible is unlikely to occur. And secondly, that these liberal beliefs will probably not occur as a whole. It'll probably lead to the dilution of religion. Never been prouder to oppose.
All right. Thank you very much to the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now I'll invite the government whip. Here.
Hello, let me get my timer. Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Up until this point, opposition has numerous benefits and impacts that are often uncertain. They're often launching a harm that is very mitigable, and at the end of the day, all they've been trying to do is co-opt the impacts or try to wash it out. We think that their strategy is largely messy. They are shifting from saying that the religion is so it's like something that often encompasses you, and suddenly they're saying at second that people will become apolitical, and that's like religion, like the sanctity of religion is depleted. We don't think that they have the clarity that's needed to win this debate. The first thing I want to kick out is their claim at second when they explain that the sanctity of religion has depleted since. One, this has no harm because this concedes that it's changed, that religion has changed over time, which feeds into Regina's framing. But secondly, religion is necessarily shaped on your personal desire in the first place. So a lot of material that second launches about how it connects to your political
political choices over time is something that can still be controlled. Largely, we'd assume that the average person won't always opt in if your parish priest says to support a specific politicians, because there are multiple barriers you need to get over to give in your full support in the first place. But moreover, we don't think this is a harm that exists. The first issue I want to get into is on the issue regarding populism and politics. This is the main claim they have in their speech. They explain that populism and popularization for religions makes politicians become icons with the revival, and there's an inherent guilt if you don't vote for these politicians. For responses to this, firstly, the logic they're using and the messaging they're using isn't popular or palatable to do anymore. The messaging that you're analogizing yourself to God, the messaging that if you do this, God would support you, and if you don't do this, God would put you in purgatory. This is not popular because people have been failed over and over again and again when politicians use this messaging. People are tired of hearing that God would want them to do this if the politician is going to eventually run a policy that doesn't work, which happened a lot in the 60s to 90s that this messaging was popular. But moreover, people are just not only tired of this type of messaging, but it feels so incredibly out of touch for the reason that if the politician is analogizing themselves to a second savior or to an image of God, people are less inclined to vote for it because they don't understand the meeting point between them and that individual, more so how that individual can extend to their innate human needs that oftentimes are very difficult to deal with. But secondly, if the issue is guilt, I already explained that they contradict themselves with guilt because they're trying to explain that religious sanctity isn't as popular or is devalued, but I note that guilt is often mitigated because A, the Bible is often against false gods in the first place. There's a lot of scriptures that can be reinterpreted over time to fight this guilt. But secondly, the way that an average human being rationalizes guilt is how much effect and participation they had over it. Sure, maybe a politician will launch a policy that will then do all good, and maybe they didn't vote for that politician, but the effect they had to that policy being enacted is so much more lesser if the act itself is just voting, which is why something like this isn't gonna haunt them forever. But thirdly, I would note and I would flip the messaging. The messaging isn't them analyzing themselves to God or saying that God would want them to do this. The popular messaging for politicians in relation to religion is narratives to love your neighbor. It is often narratives that are sympathetic and empathetic, as explained by Regina's explanation and framing, which they concede wherein society is becoming more hyper-individualized. It is like Mamdani showing his practices of how what he does as a Muslim, the participation in religion that makes you connect to these politicians because there feels like there's a meeting point instead of the politicians painting themselves as a false god or like guilt-tripping people. The last thing I want to deal with is the even if. Even if you don't believe, the more empathetic messaging is becoming more popular because the messaging of you being analogous to God or God wanting to do this is so overused and has failed people. The even if to politicization is threefold. Firstly, Kim explains already at second that this is a non-issue. Politicians will always opt into what's popular. It's unclear what the delta is. But secondly, Regina explains that there's a counterbalance. If the issue is that there is a politician that is advocating for Christians, oftentimes there will be a politician that will have to advocate for a different sect or this other sects that rise as a result of the revival that counterbalances the conservative Christianism. But thirdly, even then you don't believe that, we explain that there's a separation of church and state that necessarily marks it so that the impact of politicization is limited. The conclusion to this is very simple. We are unsure of what God would support and what policies they would want. We are unsure of how effective that evangelical messaging used to be in the 60s if it were applied today. What we are sure of are these certain solaces, the certain ability for people to know how much impact they had on politics. Moreover, the certain ability for people to connect with certain politicians when they see them practicing the same religion that is more empathetic, that is more kind, and that is something that people would opt into more. The second claim they have under this is, and this is the pivot, is that they suddenly explain people will become apolitical at second. Firstly, this is a contradiction that necessarily exists because therefore you cannot buy the first case of their first speaker. But B, people can separate their feelings. You can separate the way you view politics from the way that you encourage values. And I would flip it. I would note that what happens with the revival is you encourage more people to be political for good. Because what this religion necessarily gives you is the solace you need. It gives you the values you need to then be able to analyze what type of political spectrum you would eventually rely on. Comparatively, on their side, when people are often more lost and more uncertain, when people probably opt into more extremist things absent the revival, you're less likely to get that rationale. But thirdly, this just shows that there's a blaring gap between what they explain with as this logic and social change to exist. If anything, we would co-opt not only the impact of people being able to make good political decisions, moreover the ability for people to opt in to more social change if they're able to see with the revival of religion, and it's able to dictate certain values they have. The second issue I want to deal with is regarding the issue about minorities and solace. The first thing they have here is they explain that you force minorities to engage in majoritarian religions, and they have two mechs. The first mech is that states cannot accommodate all of these religions. This is just blatantly untrue. Like, we already explained all the reasons that the West has more resources. They're able to fund schools even outside in developing countries. They have many resources, in fact, to be able to deal with the minority religions that exist in areas. Even if the state doesn't have the resources, the demand from the people will generally naturally make it so. But secondly, the second method they have here is to explain that more engagement in majoritarian religions happens as a result of conservative framing, meaning you force minorities to do some things that they don't want. One, I already dealt with the conservative framing as early as first issue. I explained why the evangelical messaging that they're pushing isn't as popular anymore. But secondly, we also explained that other religions counterbalance it in the process, so it isn't as bad as they say. But the second response I would note under here is that it's just necessarily untrue. A lot of majoritarian religions that have sparked so much criticism and garnered so much backlash in the long run, things like Christianity being backlash because of their support of KKK or the Salem witch trials back then, it's unclear why, with his historical evidence, people will suddenly lock out that skepticism and always opt in. But I would note also that it is equally untrue that minorities who make up a strong part of these countries would suddenly give in to these majoritarian reasons. Kim's examples show support for people who are in minority religions. It is women in France who are still wearing hijabs. There's also a strong cultural connection that would make it so these minorities stay in this religion, or at least make it so that they put back friction or backlash to make sure they don't get into the majoritarian religion in the first place. But the fourth thing I would note is that in the instance that even if they do get into the majoritarian religion, what is the issue with that? At the end of the day, Regina's first argument is independent of people's political ideals or what religion they necessarily rely on. It explains the general benefit of religion, meaning they have the advocacy, they have the ability, and they have autonomy to opt into whatever religion they'd like. The conclusion of this is threefold. Firstly, we explained that minorities don't often engage in this forcing, and even if there are strong forms of support against them being indoctrinated into majoritarian religions. But secondly, that majoritarian religions have skepticism around them that already exists that counterbalance it. So we're not debating in America in the 60s where the KKK was so popular and everyone believed what the major pastor said. But thirdly, this obviously shows they have no impact, not only on solace, not only on politics, but moreover on minorities. The importance and the delta that exclusively exists on our side, if discrimination will happen regardless, is the strong accommodation you get from them. You only do that with the strong revival when you have things like Islam that start to rise. The last thing they have is to explain that the impact of solace doesn't matter, and that solace is more inclusive and diverse on their side. This is blatantly untrue because you get less ways to access solace when you limit the amount of revivals of what types of religions you have. But moreover, solace it does matter. It is one of the most important things in this debate because we are unsure of the geopolitical state of the world. We are unsure of where the political pendulum will swing. What we are sure of is that people can access more ways of stability that they would have resorted to more harmful ways to have gotten on their side. For all those reasons and more, proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much to the government whip. Now I'd like to invite the opposition whip to wrap up the substantive first set opposition here.
Okay, I would like to confirm that I am audible and visible.
Yep, we are for both.
All right. I'll take my PR as audibly, please. Pronouns as she, her. Start my speech at my next word. Panel. Within this debate, there is one fundamental question that will decide whether your ballot is going to go to prop or to op, and which is, what does this rise actually look like? Because notice, the entire proposition case strategically hinges on the premise that what it actually looks like is now the rise of liberal ways of practicing religion, in liberal alternatives. If I am able to fundamentally disprove that premise, that is exactly what the religious revival actually looks like, then that means the case fundamentally has no leg to stand on and has no premise that is actually working. Knowing that, first clash then, what does religious revival in the West actually look like? What is proposition bringing here? They tell you that it's going to be a rise in alternative forms of religion, which will be able to act as counter check and balances against more radical formats. Now, why do they tell you that this is true? The key example that I noticed here throughout their speech was they told you how you had examples like Zoran Mamdani, for example, in like New York and everything, and how he's able to still express his religion and be able to share his own religious practices within politics and everything. Panel, notice, even within the example of Zoran Mamdani, there was a ton of fear-mongering, which is to say, we can't vote this guy in. He's going to go against our majoritarian religion. He's going to implement Sharia law. It was entirely incredulous mongering, but it was fear mongering nonetheless, because there was a majoritarian religion that still had taken place, still had taken root within that country, making it so that they would then be like, more fearful towards any minority religions also rising up. But then also notice, secondly, even if they want to say that there are now going to be alternative forms of religion that would encourage alternative interpretations, notice why this is fundamentally probably untrue in terms of the extent that it will actually exist as. And this is primarily because the very religion can stand against those alternative forms in the first place. If you were to look at Christianity, for example, you have entire verses in Leviticus that people have interpreted to say that those are condemning homosexuality. This means that it's going to be very hard for someone who is maybe part of the LGBTQ plus community to decide that, yes, I want to go and be part of this religion. Part of this religion where I've been able to see historically that it was used to now oppress me, that it was used to now justify legislation against me. That is exactly what I'm going to now go into. I'm going to now create an alternative form and interpretation of that. We find that quite unlikely because the very religion, the very institutions that back that religion continue to now condemn them. But then also, thirdly, even at best, if they want to say that these alternative forms are actually rising up, notice that they are still going to be drowned out by the more conservative institutions in the first place, which is to say, you already had a bunch of conservative churches that already taken root, that have already been able to spread their influence, that have been able to spread those beliefs among people's families, those beliefs that have lasted for generations. If you grew up your entire life believing that this is the specific way for Christianity to be practiced, it is unlikely that you will suddenly change those beliefs. Those beliefs would be carried down like among the generations of your family. That is exactly what you would be continuing to spread. We find this would drown out any alternative interpretations, even at best on their side of the house. But then also, notice, the entire case fundamentally relies on just the premise and hinge that actually the world is becoming increasingly more progressive, and that is what everything looks like. Panel, no. This is something that isn't actually happening in the way that it is. Even look, for example, at the West. Look at the entire continent of Europe. There has been a mass rise in things like the rise of the conservative right wing. Why is that? It's because you had things like just our continue like geopolitical state of the world right now, where you had even, for example, among the EU, you had countries like Britain saying we want to go against Brexit because of the immigrants coming into our country. They were able to use that to justify their conservative ideals, and that is what they continued to spread. That is what it continue to take hold. That is why you have so many countries that are part of the EU right now turning to conservative right-wing politics and voting in those people within the state, even having young people vote those people within the state, because there has been a rise in this actual conservative right-wing populism just on net, whether it is in Europe and whether it is in America. And that already means that if they want to say their entire case relies upon them saying it's entirely liberal and everyone's going to be practicing this religion in a very liberal way, already that is untrue. What do we bring here? We tell you there's going to be more engagement in a majoritarian religion, but notice how this also is going to affect the rise of state populism. The main response that we get is from their P2, the point where they tell us, okay, this rise isn't something that is going to have longevity, and we need to show capacity for this to happen among a large amount of countries. A point where I already gave you the extension of the EU and how you have an increasing amount of the countries they're turning to right-wing populism and conservatism, like, just previously, historically, maybe due to like other reasons, but now that is something that is taken root in those countries. Notice how we're still able to show capacity then on our side of the house. But then also notice, since their entire case already relied on that progressive characterization, that already falls. Moving on to the second clash then, which is religious revival actually going to be beneficial to the individual? What does proposition give you here? Their entire position is on hope and solace. Notice, this has been their one unique benefit that they have been able to give you throughout the entire debate. If I am able to show you why this doesn't actually matter as much and to bring down the effects of this benefit, then proposition will have no case after my speech. I'll take you.
Yeah, so if we agree that there is conservatism and populism, then there's no margin in difference on your side of the house, because Republicans would use any narrative to justify their actions anyways. You have no way to solve this. At worst, we have
but still notice the unique power of now being able to use religion within how you actually carry out your populism, which is to say that if my entire family oriented itself around a Christian identity, and now I have this Christian leader that my church is now supporting, saying that, okay, you should vote for me, you should vote for my policies, I'm going to be pressured, not just because of the religious rhetoric that they're spewing, but because the people around me, my family, my church, my school where I go to, where I pray there, was also going to now also be pressuring me as well due to the unique amount of pressure that you can get from religious institution. That means on that, they're still going to be worse on that point. Moving on to why they don't actually provide hope and solace in their side of the house. On the benefits here, and then also just on the burdens. I want to uniquely know that they couldn't entirely state their case on just saying religion is good because of hope and solace. They needed to directly engage with our characterization on the rise, which already means on this point it really doesn't hold as much water within this debate. But then also secondly, let me work with their framing that they give us here. If they want to, first of all, just notice how they aren't good on net, because even for those vulnerable communities, if we do accept, even at their absolute best case, that you're going to have other people now joining into that religion and now also joining into those interpretations, there's going to be a unique harm to those people still at the point where this becomes their unique form of trying to get hope and solace. Which is to say, for that LGBTQ plus individual, at the point where they maybe become a Christian, then they will be condemned to now think to themselves that the only way that they're able to love others is something that they will be condemned for. If they decide to live in a way that is real and true to them, then they're probably going to go to hell. That is something that they will have to live with, and that's something they'll have to rely on to get hope and solace in their side of the house. They don't actually win on that because they don't help these vulnerable people. And then also flip, it's not actually as good as they say it is because it strips out the actual accountability for change, which is to say, I'm just not going to pray that things in the world get better instead of feeling the actual obligation to make them better, to actually, make things around me actually get better as a whole. We find that it's already bad. But then flip, notice how point of minority holds logical priority over theirs. Because notice, if I am able to prove to you that they're actually going to be drowning out minority religions, that means they're going to be even worse for providing hope and solace, because it would mean they uniquely make sure that people aren't able to get their own unique forms of hope and solace. They must rely on the majoritarian religion and its forms of hope and solace. If I can prove that onto what we bring you within this clash, we effectively win, and then one point of uniqueness doesn't hold water. We told you about how they're going to be harming minority people and the vulnerable. Their only response was that it is going to be less important. What are we bringing here? They told you that it should be institution-led and that, there'll be pushback on what isn't in the doctrine. Let me rebuild this really quickly. Because notice, if proposition wants to say that people believe this is the only way they can get hope and solace, then that makes people the majoritarian religion that has already staked its claim on institutions, on schools, on churches, on the like, would then be spreading that as the unique way that you need to get hope and solace. They would be using that to now say everyone needs to join into this specific religion to be able to get the hope and solace that we so crave and that they so relied on. Proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much, Opposition Whip. Now I'd like to invite the opposition reply. Here.
Hello, let me just open my timer. Okay. Just confirming that I'm visible.
Yes, you are.
My time begins in 3, 2, 1. During Eid last week, Muslims in France were afraid to pray in their temples for fear of ridicule. We think this is uniquely bad, and we think this is a problem that proposition does not engage with. Notice, we told you that Western states are not perfect, that they're largely flawed. 3 clashes then. Firstly, on hope and solace. Secondly, on the whole chat of whether religion will become more liberal. And thirdly, on minority benefit, on hope and solace. They tell you that you get hope and solace on proposition because you have a religion to turn to when things get hard. We reply to that. We say that you do not get better, you do not get hope and solace in religion alone. We give you alternatives like going to your community, going to your family members, relying on the people around you. We tell you that is far better in my second speech and then again in Alexis's third speech, because that then means you're quite literally fostering this community narrative. We think that is uniquely important. And even worse, panel, we tell you that this hope and solace often comes at the cost of reducing a certain part of your identity. We think that is uniquely bad. And second clash then on liberal religion. Firstly, we tell you it's very unlikely because you have the same old Caucasian church elders going on, right? We think this is uniquely bad for the debate because what this then does is that the structures that held up the religious institution are still the same, even when you have the youth coming back to religion. Secondly, we tell you that you still have verses that are explicitly translated to do not question the Lord. We think it's very hard to reinterpret these verses. And even more so, we think it's literally when it's the literal translation of the text. So every single time you pick up your Bible, every single time you pick up the Quran, you pick up the religious book, you continuously you continuously feel like this religious book is ridiculing a part of your identity, that is uniquely bad, not only for your mental stance, but also for the religion as a whole, because that also means that you disenfranchise all the members of the religion who are quite literally buying into it as part of their identity, because now they feel as though they cannot enter back into this religion because of how liberal it's become. Thirdly, on minority benefit, I think on opposition we tell you that you exploit minorities, quite literally unengaged with from my second speech. You have mega churches preaching prosperity gospels, telling people that if you do not invest a certain amount of tithe from your income, then that means you will not get out of this out of your current financial situation. We think this is bad because this then tells you that they cannot win on the whole chart of minorities, because we'd quite literally tell you these mega churches prey on their desperation, that it will not be beneficial to the individual. We think this religious revival will be dictated predominantly by majoritarian groups. Notice then again how they did not reply to that. Last clash then on why we think minority religions will be disproportionately harmed. On the whole chart of the separation of church and state, I think Joshua engaged with this beautifully. We told you that the reason we engage with majority religions is because, as the info slide states, it's seen predominantly in religions like Christianity. This then means that when you as a youth buy back into religion, you quite literally strengthen the majority religion of the state. This is quite literally visible in funds. We gave you that from first and second. And notice then, panel, we think proposition strategy has been very unclear throughout this entire round, right? Firstly, on our side, we told you that we think majoritarian religion is bad. We told you that majoritarian religion in Western states is bad. We told you that it affects minorities. And lastly, we told you that it will probably lead to them being preyed on. On their side of the house, all their premises, all their claims rely on one impact. You know what that impact is? Hope and solace. In my speech, in Alexis's speech, and now in this reply, we think we already proved to you why we think hope and solace is unlikely to occur. Because firstly, it's infringing on a certain part of your identity that's likely to disproportionately hurt you. Secondly, you probably have certain religious elders who are looking down on you that really hurts your identity even more. And thirdly, we told you that it's far better to get hope and solace from the people around you. It's far better to take actionable steps instead of relying on the idea of God that your mega church has pushed to you. I've never been prouder to oppose.
All right, thank you very much to the opposition reply. Opposition reply. Yep. Now I'd like to invite the government reply to wrap up the debate. Here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. The first thing I want to do is to break the framing battle that exists within the debate. Opposition says two main things. The first is that religion is inherently oppressive and coercive. The second is that religion is inseparable from politics. I will deal with it both and explain why we win even if you buy this characterization. On the first, that religion is oppressive and coercive. Note, you can only believe this if they can explain why, absent the revival, politicians are not going to be oppressive, or the margin is quite significant. What we explain very clearly from Depth, First, and Whip is that politicians and malicious powers will always have the incentive to act in very bad ways. They don't explain why it's uniquely because of religion that they're able to carry out many of these malicious things. What this means is that this is a non-issue. You cannot necessarily believe that it's something you can uniquely attribute to the rise of religion. But additionally, we note that this is only relevant if the examples they provide weren't minority incentives. They debate on very small, minute examples that often exist on the fringes. For example, they claim prosperity gospel. Problem, you're unmuted by the way. Problem, prosperity gospel hasn't been very popular for a very long time. The forms of religion that we explain to you are probably things that are very median and that anyone can opt into, therefore equating to the rise. The revival cannot happen if the vast majority of people do not believe it and do not agree with it, which is why you logically have to believe that our framing is far more correct. But additionally, it is unclear why the number of people who opt into their forms of religion grow in numbers so significantly, because we explain that the rise and the revival refers to all forms of religion, which means that the baseline increases. So maybe there's a lot of Trumpist and MAGA religious rhetoric, but there are also the rise of like the Vatican and Pope Leo and people defending him, talking about why, for example, all such things are invalid, which means that there are many different forms of religion that is encompassed by the revival. You cannot necessarily believe that it is just one small version of religion. The second thing they explain is that religion is inseparable from politics. Note that there is a massive contradiction from this, because at first they explain that it is charged politically, but at deputy they explain that, well, people will become very apolitical and this is dangerous. This characterization means that it knifes each other. You cannot fully believe the extent of benefits reliant on this frame then, but we win in both instances. Why? Because if religion is politically charged, we explain that conservatism and populism would have existed in either scenario. Religion was important to break through these things, not only to give people solace, but because it provides necessary counter narratives in the form of Pope Leo and imams, many examples that both my partners exemplify and myself as well. But additionally, we explain that in the case that people become apolitical, this is a very, very small harm because they don't explain the certainty of the benefit. So what if people are political? They explain themselves that it's so politically charged today, it's unclear what the impact in the end of this means. We think the far more certain benefit is being able to feel assured in yourself and to know that there is something to look forward to in the future. On our side, we explain three things. The first, that religious revival is a spectrum. So perhaps it is imperfect. We concede to this. But it was necessary because it brought about the discussions about female bishops. It brought about more libertarian ideas. But secondarily, we explain that religion has become more empathetic. Why? Because there were many reasons and incentives to shift to become more libertarian. To no response, Regina explains that they needed to keep up with the youth who were already turning away from religion, which is why they allowed female altar boys, which is why they allowed female bishops and the like. There were many incentives to be more liberal, which is why you have to believe our frame and by extension our impacts. But we explain as well that at third, that the greatest and most certain benefit is the solace that we are able to give people in trying times. They don't explain what the alternative is, but they do, however, agree that trying times exist at present and people are struggling. So if they do not turn to religion, then you have to believe the alternatives that we suggest because they do not seem to explain what other people will turn to if not religion. For all such reasons, I will see you in the semi. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much to the government reply. Thank you very much to all of the teams. It was a very, very amazing debate. You may cross the floor and then leave the room, and we will call you in once we are done with the deliberations. Thank you so much, everyone. Good debate.